AI has been transforming every industry, but the potential of technology is largely untapped. The impact on healthcare goes beyond what is affected by COVID 19, and today we have Dr. Manish Gupta, an AI expert, who will discuss the importance of inculcating AI based platforms to improve access to healthcare. Dr. Gupta is the director of Google Research India. He holds an additional appointment as Infosys Foundation Chair Professor at IIIT Bangalore. He also leads VideoCan, a video technology startup, and research centers for Xerox and IBM in India. Over to you, Dr. Gupta.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Can you see my slides?
Yes, Dr. Gupta. We can't see your slides yet. Yes.
Okay. So again, thanks again for inviting me. I'll be talking about transforming healthcare via artificial intelligence, and I'd like to start by acknowledging contributions from some of my colleagues that I'll be describing today. So what I'll start with is, I mean, if you really look at the healthcare system in various countries, I would claim that there's not a single country today on the planet which is happy with its healthcare system. They're all trying to figure out how to improve uh, the quality of healthcare while reducing costs, because nobody wants to reduce costs in healthcare, take chances. So the goal is to continue to enhance the quality, but a lot of countries are very worried about the high cost. And you can look at this particular chart, which shows the per capita expenditure on healthcare in various countries. And again, the top country on this chart is the United States. And again, I mean, this is slightly old data from 2018, but the again trends are continue to go upwards. So the latest numbers are again higher than what the numbers are indicated on these slides. So in the US, you are spending over 10,000 US dollars per person per annum on healthcare, and this is not when somebody falls sick. This is in an average year for an average individual. So the country realizes that this is unsustainable, and there have been efforts like Obamacare and so on to try and uh, reduce the cost again while improving quality. Now you look at another country like UK, where the costs are much lower, and in fact, if you look at the outcomes, things like life expectancy and so on, some of these are actually better than the US. So you might be tempted to think that it's only the US which is the outlier. The other countries are doing fine. But if you were to look at the trends, the change in healthcare costs uh, uh, as time progresses, you'll find all of these countries are again struggling with rising costs of healthcare. And again, the National Health Service in UK, the primary provider of health service there, is very, again, focused on trying to improve quality while reducing costs. Um, and on this set of uh, charts, the only country which doesn't seem to have this problem of very high average cost per person is India. And somebody who's not familiar with India might think that we are doing something great in healthcare. And here, the reason we all know in India, the reason this number is so low is because we don't provide access to healthcare to much of our population. So we have a severe, in addition to the problems that these other countries are facing, we have a severe shortage of doctors. So especially when you go to rural areas, you won't even find uh, medically trained doctors available in the primary healthcare centers for these villages. So, as you go about the task of providing decent healthcare to much of the population in India, uh, we obviously cannot afford to take the path that countries like the US or even UK have taken. If you were to simply multiply, for instance, uh, the per capita numbers from any of these countries, whether it's US or UK, by the population of India, you'll get a number that exceeds our entire GDP. So obviously, that level of is unsustainable for India. We need to find a better way. So what's that better way? Uh, what I would say is, again, listening to healthcare experts, this is the slide that I drew more through my lens as a computer system person and also a compilers person. Uh, so one of the keys to transforming healthcare is to really make it consumer centric. Today, healthcare tends to be much more provider centric. The doctor is really at the center of everything. So there have been, in fact, healthcare experts talking about this whole phenomena of healthcare becoming consumer centric, exemplified by one of the books written by Eric Topolaw, uh, um, "The Patient Will See You Now," which is like again a pun on the usual uh, thing that you hear, the doctor will see you now. So the idea there is to really look at the patient as a consumer and look at really delivering value for every rupee that they are spending on healthcare, to really deliver value the way you find, for instance, retailers and so on, right? Uh, Vying to deliver value to the consumer. Uh, and that includes, again, trying to find ways of reducing wastage. And because otherwise, when you have a provider centric system, there's an inherent kind of an incentive to prescribe more expensive treatment, even wasteful tests, and so on, because it leads to added revenue for providers. But when you're really focused more on the consumer, and there's a certain fixed sum of money, for instance, that healthcare providers get to take care of the health of those consumers, then there's obviously an inherent incentive for healthcare providers to go in for practices that lead to lower cost, while of course maintaining quality. The other aspect of how healthcare really needs to be transformed is to become more proactive. Again, there's a saying, prevention is better than cure. And you can see that saying applied to the different tiers of the healthcare system. So, as I listened to the healthcare experts, what I realized is similar to, for instance, the computer systems that we build, right, where there is a notion of a memory hierarchy. Um, the healthcare system itself is built in all these tiers. Uh, there's a primary healthcare center system, then a secondary, then tertiary, and the ultimate place in healthcare where you go when everything else fails is the ICU. And ICU is an incredibly expensive place to treat a person. Typically, you would end up spending more to spend that night in an ICU than you might spend in a exotic, whatever, in a five-star hotel in an exotic location. And it's not a particularly fun place to spend your night. So, if you could take care of that patient before they have to go to the ICU, when they were in the regular section of the hospital, that would be better. And 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 you can keep extending that argument. I mean, if you could take care of that person at the primary healthcare level before they have to be moved to a super specialty hospital for treatment, that's much better. And take continuing that argument, if you can take care of people when they're living their normal lives at home and at work, that's going to be far better than waiting for them to fall sick and then taking care of them. So what, and it is in that making things more proactive, making healthcare really kind of much more timely, proactive, and kind of focusing on wellness and prevention. That's where AI can play a very significant role. So I'll give two examples of uh, both fitting in this theme of how AI could be applied to make healthcare more proactive. So my first example is from the work that, in fact, got folks at Google Research started on healthcare, which is screening for diabetic retinopathy. So diabetic retinopathy is a major cause and growing cause of blindness for people across the world. So there are, again, over 400 million people across the world with diabetes condition, and they are potentially susceptible to this condition, diabetic retinopathy. And if not treated in time, it can lead to blindness. So regular screening is really the key to preventing blindness. The problem in a country like ours is that we have a severe shortage of eye doctors. You can actually pick up any specialty and you'll find, yes, there is a severe shortage of doctors with that specialty for a country the size of India. So, what ends up happening is that 45% of the patients end up suffering vision loss before they are ever diagnosed. Uh, and the way diagnosis is done is that you take these images of the retinal fundus using a special camera, and the doctors examine those images, and essentially they're looking for signs for things like hemorrhages, um, and and based on that they grade these images on a 5-point scale, where 1 is no diabetic retinopathy and 5 is a very high level proliferative diabetic retinopathy. So what our researchers set out to do was, uh, can we analyze these images automatically to start grading them on what level of diabetic retinopathy they have? So what we used for this purpose was to adapt the usual deep neural network that had been built for image classification. So image classification, for those of you who have been tracking the history of deep learning, was one of these problems that led to really the comeback of artificial neural networks uh, around the year 2011, and kind of relabeled as deep learning, where you had tremendous success in being able to uh, correctly classify images. Is that an image of a dog or a cat, or kind of what object is there in that image? So we took essentially the same architecture, neural architecture, and adapted it to start doing this grading of the image on this 5-point scale, to see the level of diabetic retinopathy. Now, the initial results, again, there were a lot of issues with the initial levels of accuracy, but the team worked on a variety of improvements uh, to ultimately obtain results that were comparable to those obtained by a general ophthalmologist. And some of those results, some of those techniques included kind of using finer resolution, the usual hyperparameter tuning. But one very interesting technique that they used was uh, an adjudication. So sorry, I realize I'm missing that slide. What happened is, I mean, when you have these images, uh, for the same person, sometimes different doctors can have different diagnosis for that same image. So while in many cases doctors agree, uh, there would always be those complicated cases where maybe some doctors say, oh, there isn't much of diabetic retinopathy, whereas others say, no, there is a case of a moderate or severe diabetic retinopathy. So in such cases, what we did was we used an adjudication process where when there was disagreements among these ophthalmologists, we would go to retinal specialists, ask them to independently rate those images. And if there was agreement, you took that as ground truth. And if there wasn't agreement, then you got them in a room to again, those were pre-COVID times, or maybe this was done kind of, I mean it figuratively, you get them to talk to each other and agree upon a consensus decision, which we took as ground truth. So using that process again helped us tremendously improve the accuracy of the algorithm. So the initial paper that was published by the team appeared in 2016 in the Journal of American Medical Association, uh, where again they showed these results, which were getting accuracy comparable to a general ophthalmologist. And then the team, and in fact this paper was very well received. I mean, you can see some of these quotes. The work the study by Gulshan and colleagues. So Varun Gulshan was the lead author who, in fact, on this paper, who also initiated this work. He's one of our research scientists at our research lab. In fact, he did this work. He, in fact, started this work well before the Google Research Lab even existed. So he was pretty much the first researcher who moved to India for personal reasons and initiated this work. And earlier this year, this paper was rated among the 10 best JAMA papers in the last decade by that journal, by that very reputed journal. So this is again clear validation by the medical community of the importance of, again, the field of deep learning, right? That how it is going to impact medicine. Uh, in fact, later the team went on to improve these results further, and they obtained results comparable to retinal specialists. So while these results were very, very impressive, I also want to caution that, I mean, it is important for us not to get carried away in the usual deep learning hype, and recognize that still there are many, many challenges that we face, especially as we look to deploy such algorithms which are being used to kind of make make help humans make decisions that will affect human lives, uh, how to make the right kind of help humans make the right kind of decisions. And one of the considerations, for instance, is one of safety. uh, 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 Another issue is explainability, because it would be nice if these deep learning algorithms are able to actually explain why they come up with a particular recommendation, so that the human doctor who's ultimately making the diagnosis uh, can have more confidence in the recommendation. And also, one of the things that happens is, even though these deep learning algorithms like this one that I showed are achieving extremely good results on an average, there are always situations where they would make mistakes, the kind of which a human might not make. Uh, and and another potentially challenging aspect of neural networks making those mistakes is that often even state-of-the-art deep learning systems make mistakes in a very confident manner. If you were to look for what's their confidence in giving out this answer, even when these networks are wrong, they may be very confident about those predictions. And I would contrast that with humans, because typically when a human is faced with with a complicated case, typically we know that we don't know, right? And again, as an example, I mean, let's say there's a tough question in an exam, we know when we don't know the answer. And likewise, when a doctor sees a very complicated case, typically they know, yes, this is kind of a complex case, and often the doctor might consult other colleagues to get a second opinion before they make a diagnosis. Uh, so an active area of research at Google, as well as the research community, is how to do better calibration of these deep learning models, how to better estimate the certainty of deep learning models, which is going to be very, very important when you deploy it in, for instance, especially in domains like healthcare. Next, let me talk about another example. And this is again from what you might do at home and at work. And again, I mean, my uh, prediction is that the real action in healthcare in the future is going to be outside the hospitals, is going to be what do you do when people are living their normal lives. Uh, and the reason for that is that, again, you're seeing all these trends of people using all these mobiles, wearables, and there are also cameras that are getting deployed, for instance, at home, which are quite powerful. Through these kinds of devices, you can actually monitor a whole bunch of activity and body vitals related to an individual. So if you are, and in many of these cases, again, you need to again further apply AI to extract all of those signals. But you can uh, by analyzing the data that you get from mobiles, wearables, cameras, and so on, you can infer a whole bunch of body vitals of individuals, things like their heart rate variability, temperature, and so on. What kind of activities they are engaging in? Are they getting enough exercise? What kind of food are they eating? Um, Potentially, you can try to infer the state of stress that the individual might be experiencing, uh, as well as the state of the environment. And by analyzing all of these signals, you can actually start to build risk models for various diseases. What diseases is this person at a risk for developing, and corresponding to those, uh, are there certain interventions that can be applied early to have better outcome for the person. So let me give you an example for a concrete disease, which is the cardiovascular disease, which is the number one killer for humans on the planet. Uh, and if you look at again the Indian context, a very kind of a sad factoid is that for so many people in India who are dying of a heart attack or a stroke, it is estimated that roughly 80% of the people uh, are not even aware, who have that heart attack or a stroke, are not even aware that they are suffering from cardiovascular disease. So that's the kind of a sad part. The positive aspect is that there's clearly potential in most of these cases to either completely prevent that heart attack or stroke, or significantly delay that event, uh, through, again, if the person early enough, right, in their lifetime, if they engage in certain modifications to their lifestyle and take certain, go for certain medical interventions. So what are those interventions? So let me again explain what we are trying to do on this project on prevention of cardiovascular disease. And we are focusing primarily on the mobile as the sensor in the Indian context. What we are trying to do is to get, again, these signals from the sensors, um, things like heart rate variability, and so on of the individual, as well as what kind of exercise are they getting, um, are they kind of getting enough of the moderate, at least moderate level of exercise that's recommended for an individual to lower their risk for cardiovascular disease. Are they smoking? Because smoking is a very key risk factor. What are they eating? The kind of, you can, so it turns out that today, right, using computer vision techniques, if somebody shares a photograph of the food that they're eating, you can actually do estimation of things like calorie value of that food serving. You can try to estimate what kind of antioxidants might be there in that food, by analyzing, as well as things like, you can even try to estimate the salt content. You may not be able to do it perfectly, but you can do like a rough classification of what kind of a food that is that a bhujia or a samosa that you're eating. And with that classification, again, with some assumptions, simplifying assumptions, that okay, they're only uh, assuming that that samosa or whatever, that bhujia or whatever, that dal has been prepared in a standard manner, what kind of salt content it might have, what kind of calorie content it might have. So you can do such kinds of analysis, uh, and by applying machine learning over all of this rich data, you can build risk scores, CVD, which is cardiovascular disease risk score for individuals to assess their level of risk. Uh, and and the nice part about the cardiovascular disease is that it is actually preventable, or you can actually delay the onset of the disease through very simple lifestyle modifications, which can be very, very effective. Things like getting at least 30 minutes of moderate exercise each week, not indulging in smoking, limiting your salt content to of the order of no more than 5 grams in a day, and so on. So based on what you're observing of the individual, you can actually then suggest these lifestyle modifications. And if let's say the blood pressure of the person continues to be high, you can also, so in some of these cases, like blood pressure measurement through these wearables and so on is still not at a level which is accurate enough. So that's still an open problem. But assuming, again, you have other ways of offline being able to get the blood pressure measurement of the person, uh, a combination of these lifestyle changes and simple medical interventions like keeping your blood pressure and your blood sugar level under control, they can dramatically kind of delay, lead to dramatically better outcomes for you as an individual. And one of the challenges that I want to point out here is that this is also something that requires a fair amount of research on human interactions with AI systems, because sometimes the AI part of identifying the risk level of the individual, uh, in this case, is actually the easier part. The much tougher part is convincing that human, right, to forego whatever that samosa that they are craving so much, uh, because it will lead to a better outcome for them down the road. So how do you effectively engage the user, and actually persuade them to adopt the recommendations that you're making? It's still a huge challenge, and a lot more research needs to be done. So we've been looking at, rather than only giving them notifications, can you engage the human in a dialogue? And there is again a lot of research being done on how to structure that dialogue in a persuasive manner so that you're actually able to convince the end user to take your recommendation. Now, an obvious concern that arises in the context of such applications is the data privacy. That all of this data that is getting collected from my mobile phone, my, let's say, heart rate measurements, the activities, what food I'm eating, am I smoking or not, how much exercise am I getting, and so on. A lot of this is, how am I living my life? This is very, very sensitive information, and I may not want uh, even a cloud of a reputable company like Google to have that data. So, so one of the technologies that we've been looking at utilizing for such applications is federated learning, which got invented at Google Research a few years ago, and today it is being used by many, many academic organizations as well as other companies which are utilizing the technology because of its value in helping you keep your sensitive data private. So in a nutshell, what federated learning lets you do is to uh, keep some of this sensitive data, allow you to do machine learning in a manner that some of that sensitive data, that raw data, for instance, which is being obtained on your mobile phone, it stays within that mobile device. The raw data is never stored on a cloud, on the centralized server. What you do is you initially train the machine learning model using some proxy data, and you distribute an initial machine learning model on each of the devices, and then you start refining those machine learning models on each of those devices in a very distributed manner, where each device is only looking at the data that it sees, but that raw data is not being sent back to the central server. Now, the obvious uh, challenge, if you were to drawback, if you were to just stop there, would be that how do you kind of learn effective, robust models, right, from the data for just a single device, right? You're not going to do a very good job of building that machine learning model. So what federated learning does is to, again, do that learning in that federated manner, where these devices are then sharing not the raw data, but certain aspects, certain parameters of the machine learning models that they are learning with the centralized server, and allowing that centralized server, the cloud, to learn an overall machine learning model that incorporates all of that data that you might be getting from all those potentially millions of devices, and then again distribute back that learned model onto these devices. So, and there are techniques like differential privacy when you combine. So, because the obvious question is, what if even though you're not sharing your raw data, uh, your data could still be getting leaked through the centralized model that is getting created, because uh, some an adversary may be able to again do certain operations with the centralized model and be able to recover the original raw data for an individual. And again, that can be essentially avoided by using differential privacy, which then by design ensures that the centralized model is not able to uh, uh, track any of the individual data that's ascribed to a individual user. So with this, while we are right now focused on applying this methodology to cardiovascular disease prevention, um, I would say this methodology can actually be applicable to many other kinds of diseases, including various forms of cancer, where you can do early screening, and we know, for instance, for many forms of cancer, they are very treatable if they are diagnosed at an early enough stage, right? So that same theme, that if you are able to take more timely actions, if you are able to do the screening in a timely manner, you can and act on that information, you can actually have much better outcomes for the individual, and also achieve lower cost, because uh, treating that cancer at an early stage is going to be much cheaper than treating that cancer when it has advanced. Finally, let me talk about uh, some work that we are doing in public health as part of our AI for Social Good program. Um, and this is where what we did was we went to a whole bunch of NGOs, the not non-profits, who were solving various meaningful problems for various communities that they operated in. And we brought them in a workshop and we asked them to describe their work and the challenges that they were facing, and identify which were some of the challenges where AI could make a difference, could be applied to make a difference. So, as a result of those discussions in that workshop that we conducted in November last year, we then selected these 6 projects that we funded, these NGOs along with academic partners, to explore AI-based solutions. And let me give one example of one of these projects. So this is with an NGO called Arman, which has a program, M-Mitra program, to improve maternal and child health uh, uh, for ladies. So they what they do is they work with expecting mothers, and essentially what they do is they deliver these voice messages over the mobile phone to that expecting mother. For every week of the pregnancy, there's a different message that tells them to about things to watch out for during that week, any special precautions they should take, as well as things like any dietary supplement they should take during that week. And the same, these series of messages continues during the first 6 months of the child's life after the childbirth, and again providing helpful tips about how to take care of the baby. And what Arman has done uh, several formal studies which have shown significantly improved outcomes for both these mothers and their babies when they stick with this program. The unfortunate part is that they find roughly half of the women actually dropping out of this program for various reasons. So they asked us to apply AI to see if we could help predict which of these mothers were likely to drop out, expecting mothers were likely to drop out of that program, and come up with more effective engagement for these expecting mothers. And in this joint work that we did with IIT Madras, uh, our AI model was able to predict over 80% of the women who were going to drop out. So we validated these results on the real data that Arman had on the women who actually dropped out. And this model has now been deployed in production at Arman, and they are right now doing a rigorous evaluation. So based on these predictions, they are reaching out in a special manner to those women who are at a high risk for dropping out, and they are now measuring uh, what kind of improved outcomes are they able to achieve as a result. So they are already seeing signs that this prediction is helping them uh, uh, engage, helping them reach to the right set of women, and they are able to keep them through these special engagements, keep them uh, on this program, and now they're trying to measure the overall impact in terms of improved outcome that they're able to get as a result of this intervention, which is driven by AI. So I hope I've given you kind of a good flavor of some of what we are doing, and already in this kind of work, I would say we have encountered many challenges, and these are typical of almost any work that is done on healthcare, on applying AI to healthcare. One of them is that the data invariably that you're operating on is very noisy. When you're relying on kind of measurements of whatever, whether it's say temperature or medication or any particular kind of body vital or medical intervention and so on, when you're looking at uh, uh, the recorded data, often you'll find things like missing values. Instead of the temperature being nicely taken at every 4 hour or 8 hour interval, you'll find missing values. And sometimes these missing values themselves are meaningful. That maybe there's a missing value because the patient was feeling well, right? So there, you didn't feel that need to take that measurement. So how do you account for such noisy data? There are issues like data privacy that I kind of referred to during my talk, that healthcare data tends to be very sensitive. Another issue is this class imbalance, which I would say is good thing for us as humans, because if you were to do a prediction of any kind of risk, right? Let's say, is this person at a risk for having a heart attack over the next 5 years? Uh, what is good for us as humans is that you take any kind of typical sample, right? If we were to sample people in the audience, right? Who amongst the audience is at a high risk of a heart attack in the next 5 years? The answer is very few. So that's the good thing for us as humans, that typically at any given time, when you're trying to predict something bad that might happen to you in terms of a disease, uh, relatively few people are at the high risk. But the problem that it creates for the machine learning algorithm is that it creates a class imbalance, because now the whatever people, the number of samples in that whatever bad class that you're trying to predict is much smaller than the number of samples in the good class. Uh, uh, and so what happens is, even when you have seemingly very high levels of accuracy, you might have, let's say, specificity of 95%, which looks very good, that you're going to, whatever, 95% of the time when you say, yes, this person is at this high risk, you're right 95% of the time. But when you have such class imbalance, you find yourselves in situations where the number of false positives, it actually exceeds the number of true positives, the number of true cases that you've identified. So even at 95% sensitivity and specificity, given the class imbalance, you may find, oh, uh, uh, you're wrong in some 50 cases, and the actual number of true cases was only of the order of 10. So how do you And that leads to, again, in the medical community, a lot of these deployed AI systems, which predict kind of complications, they are routinely ignored by doctors and nurses, not because they don't care, it's because these are false alarms. Um, then there are issues of fairness. Are you uh, all too often? I mean, there could be many slips in the whole machine learning pipeline, right from the kind of data, the variety in the data that you're building your models on. If you're not careful, you could have a model that does very well for the maybe the majority groups, but doesn't handle certain minority groups very well, and is very inaccurate for them. Another aspect which I covered earlier was the safety aspect. How do you get the machine calibrate the machine learning model to be able to say, I'm not sure, and therefore please do not take my recommendation with a pinch of salt, uh, 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 even when you're using that as a decision support system. And of course, explainability. How do you explain your prediction to the doctor who ultimately has to make the diagnosis? So, I hope I've given you kind of a flavor of what the current kind of what are some of the uh, interesting examples of problems where AI can be used to make a difference. At the same time, I'll acknowledge that what I've talked about is only kind of uh, you can view it as the tip of the iceberg or only like a small percentage of what is possible in today's world. So there's a lot of, again, AI based innovation that many startups, other companies, and academic researchers are working on. So it's a very exciting time to be again an AI researcher, because you can work on these meaningful problems, and there are still plenty of challenges that need to be overcome before you're truly able to have that impact. And those are, again, opportunities to do even more interesting research. So let me stop here, and I can take a few questions if there is time. You're on mute, Niharika. Can you? I can't hear you.
Sorry, Dr. Manish. Uh, Thank you, Dr. Gupta. That was such an exemplary session. It provided interesting insight on how AI is being applied to transform healthcare industry, especially making it patient-centric. Our audience had a few questions. I like the previous session. I have incorporated them into themes so that it is easier to navigate through them. Um, One of the common questions in the audience is, are AI models able to regulate the dosage of medicines, or recommend to doctors what drugs are supposed to be used for a certain patient or condition?
Yeah, so again, I mean, there is a fair amount of research being done. So, for instance, for specific kinds of cancer, yes, there is work being done on applying AI to identify kind of what level of maybe radiotherapy, radiation therapy, and so on, right, to administer to an individual. Uh, so, yes, there are specific examples where such things can be done. At the same time, because of all these safety issues and so on, and the healthcare industry is regulated for a good reason, because you really can't afford to kind of play with people's lives. Most of these systems are ultimately really aids to doctors who can use some of these systems, but ultimately they make the decisions about the treatment for patients.
Thank you. Um, One of the audience members had a question about fake news in healthcare. And can any of the AI models identify these fake news and curb the dissemination of these?
Yes. So, I mean, there's again a fair amount, and that's a real problem. So there is a fair amount of work being done. For instance, when we look at COVID, right, there has been a lot of fake news about COVID, and again, I mean, there are different techniques where you can use to try and uh, detect those outliers, to detect instances of fake news. But what makes it a hard problem is that often, right? I mean, it's not sometimes, unfortunately, it's not just an outlier. You may have very, very reputed or powerful people, right? I mean, there have been, I don't want to get political, but there have been statements made by President Trump, which in fact were taken out because it was fake news, right? I mean, a lot of what Trump says is actually kind of uh, outright lying or completely misinformed, right? And sometimes social media, right, encourages this creation of communities and filter bubbles where you're only listening to opinion from like-minded individuals who think like you. So it's not just like a small group. It could be a fairly large community that is engaged in certain kinds of discussions. So it is not a trivial problem to solve, but yes, I mean, it is an important problem where AI needs to be applied.
Also, Dr. Gupta, there were some questions about how the government systems can handle AI in terms of upskilling of the workers, and how the application of AI in the existing primary care systems, can it drive up costs for some time, or will it actually contribute to reduction of costs? And then with upskilling of healthcare professionals, and with all the other system integrations that need to be done.
No, that's a great point. So first of all, for instance, in the Indian context, where you have such severe shortage of doctors, one of the key areas where again AI can be applied is to upskill the healthcare workers, right, who are providing healthcare to the communities, and equip them with these tools that will help them with better uh, kind of diagnosis and so on. And also, I mean, even for regular doctors, I mean, there are other things that can help, because today the medical research, right, keeps evolving at such a fast pace that often there is a significant lag between kind of new discoveries and new kind of guidelines being kind of proposed by, let's say, the body of specialists in a given area, and it takes often a while before doctors are broadly practicing those guidelines. So again, some of that process can be accelerated with the use of technologies from AI. So yes, absolutely, skilling and kind of information dissemination is another important aspect.
Um, just the final question for this talk. Uh, Application of federated learning models can sometimes limit personalized service delivery and patient-centric service delivery. So, what are the ways? Could you elaborate on the ways that are considered to? You did touch upon it a little bit. Could you elaborate a little bit on how that can be mitigated?
Can you come again? I mean, are you talking about the potential downside of personalized?
No, what I meant is the federated learning model might cause a disruption in the personalizing of these services of the patient-centric model.
Sorry. There was some disturbance. I couldn't hear your question. Can you come again? Sorry.
Sorry. So, what I was trying to say is the federated learning models that you briefly mentioned in your talk, they might limit personalized service provision to the patients. Is there a way to mitigate the downsides of federated learning?
Okay. Yeah. So see, what happens is federated learning, uh, by its very nature, will often have either kind of reduction in accuracy, as well as kind of higher computational costs, right? When you are not sharing that data centrally. So again, a lot of research is being done on how to mitigate those issues, and achieving. For instance, can you send more of these messages and so on, and ensure an acceptable level of accuracy when it comes to kind of learning those models. Uh, you may not get to the same level as if the uh, model was built on a completely like shared centralized data. But here the alternative is not so much that centralized data. The alternative is nothing at all, right? If the patients were otherwise going to be not comfortable sharing their data, but now because of these privacy preserving techniques and so on, now they feel more comfortable sharing that data. Overall, the higher scale that you can get, right, the more richer data that you can get because of those concerns being addressed, in my view, should in most cases lead to actually higher levels of accuracy, because otherwise you wouldn't have got that data in the first place.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta.